Well, hello and welcome to Hudson Institute for today's discussion on targeting kleptocracy. It is a huge week on that front, as I'm sure if you're watching this, you'll be aware, with the launch of the first ever US strategy on countering corruption by the Biden administration on Monday, and the inclusion of anti-corruption as a major pillar, if not the major pillar of the Summit for Democracy. I'm Nate Sibley. I'm a research fellow here at Hudson Institute, working on the Kleptocracy Initiative, where we research policy measures to counter corruption from authoritarian regimes. And I'm delighted that joining me today is someone who has spent much of his Senate career doing exactly that, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who has represented Rhode Island in the US Senate since 2007, before which he served as the state's attorney general and as a US attorney. So someone who knows a lot about both democracy and the rule of law. No surprise whatsoever, he's become such a bipartisan champion of measures to counter corruption and kleptocracy during his time in the Senate. He's also been a great friend to Hudson and to the Kleptocracy Initiative. And so, Senator, it's with great pleasure I welcome you back to Hudson today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you, and I want to return the compliment to Hudson and to the Kleptocracy Initiative, which have been really important. And we're, I guess you could say, fussing about kleptocracy before it was cool.
That's right.
And now we've got democracy summits focusing on it and all of that. And both Hudson Institute and the Kleptocracy Initiative, I think, had a lot to do with bringing us to where we are. So bravo and well done, and let's keep working together.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. These are very, very kind words. And it also leads us on maybe just to take a few minutes for some opening remarks. Maybe you could tell us how you came to this issue of kleptocracy. I mean, anyone watching either Senator Whitehouse or the Kleptocracy Initiative probably knows about the threat of kleptocracy, but I think it's always worth restating at the start. What brought you to focus so keenly on this issue of kleptocracy? It's not perhaps something that your constituents in Rhode Island think about every day in the way that they might think of other sort of policy issues. So why are you so focused on this issue? Why is it such a threat?
Well, a few things have circled this issue in my experience. One, right off the bat, has been the role of dark money in interfering with American politics. I gave an awful lot of speeches about how climate denial has kept us from addressing the climate crisis, and how dark money fueled the climate denial operation that obstructed our path. At the same time, you saw these international scandals from the Panama Papers and now the Pandora Papers and others that showed how foreign entities, very often ones allied with us, were giving aid and comfort to our enemies by hiding their ill-gotten gains behind rule of law screens. The national security component of that became more and more apparent as it became more and more apparent that our dangerous rivals in this world were often supported by this dark money, kleptocracy, autocracy, criminality world, whether it was evil coming out of ungoverned and ungovernable spaces or rivals using that to their advantage against us to try to knock down democracy. And it became more and more apparent to me that this was a national security imperative as well as an integrity imperative. And I think a lot of other people were beginning to come to that same thought as well. I wrote a piece with General Petraeus on this subject some years ago that I think had a lot of impact, and the DC think tankery started to come around to this concern more aggressively. And it all comes together under the general rubric that what goes on in the dark is usually pretty reprehensible, and a little bit of daylight is the best disinfectant.
That's fantastic. I remember your piece with General Petraeus well. I remember it created a big buzz, a lot of excitement, that people of your sort of stature were sort of really taking this on as a national security issue. So we've had we can talk a bit more about that side of things in a minute, but this has been, as I mentioned at the opening, quite a big week for anti-corruption efforts here in Washington, and indeed hopefully around the world. And I just wondered if you had wanted to take a few minutes and react to the Biden administration dropping this new strategy at the start of the week, probably easily the most comprehensive strategy for countering kleptocracy that any US administration has ever brought forward, and the way it's being featured at the Summit for Democracy. You wrote a piece about this in the Boston Globe I think it was last week, perhaps, or a few days ago, which I read is absolutely fantastic and sets out this challenge. Maybe you could just sort of reiterate what your thoughts are on the developments this week.
Well, I'm very excited about it. I think you and I both agree that we actually are in a clash of civilizations in this modern world. I just see that clash of civilizations rather differently than Samuel Huntington did. I think that the clash of civilizations is between rule of law and the kleptocracy, autocracy, criminality world, and that pretty much all of the evil that has befallen our country has come out of that world, and we need to address it as a national security imperative. And so lifting that up to the top of the national security conversation, I think is a very important decision, completely, on its own, without any further reinforcement. And then you get to the further reinforcement in the Democracy Summit of calling on our allies to build a common wall to defend against that abuse of rule of law by the evildoers, to use an old Bush phrase, on the other side of that rule of law divide from us. And I think the combination of the elevation of the idea and the commitment of the US to try to forge an international consensus. I mean, imagine how great it would be if it was just as frowned upon, just as unacceptable to shelter foreign dark money in your country as it is to provide child labor out of your country. And I think if you put it into that kind of a context of what a wrong it is to society, there's a real opportunity. But of course, people will want to cheat. People will always want to be the free riders. And so you have to have the kind of determination that the Biden administration is showing to get everybody on board to make it work. So those are the two big things. They elevated it, and they're set a goal to implement a very solid international consensus that you just can't allow crooks to hide their money in your country any longer.
We can talk a bit about how crooks do that. We can talk about the crooks in a minute. I love talking about the crooks themselves, but also, there's the other side of the coin. You mentioned what we've come to call the enablers, the very harmful minority of professionals, lawyers, and so on, bankers in the US and Western Europe, who help launder this money and arguably not only facilitate transnational corruption, but have actually incentivized it to an unprecedented degree, which is why we now have global kleptocracy instead of national corruption. So I wonder if you could talk about, a bit more about that side of things, because you've been very focused on that in your legislating.
Well, we've had pretty good effort out of the banking community because they're by law required to watch out for money laundering. And it's a pretty effective part of the financial world where the banks operate. They were very helpful to us as we were fighting to clean up the American shell corporation problem, the so-called beneficial ownership rule that we got through the last National Defense Bill, telling, by the way, that it was in the National Defense Bill, is now in the Treasury Department with its regulations being developed. I'd actually hope that would be part of the announcement of the Democracy Summit, that they were coming out with big, strong regs, but we'll see whether that's going to happen or not. And it was in that context of fighting over that law that the bankers were actually very, very helpful, pushing on some of the organizations that these other groups had stood up to oppose us. So we first had to fight through the US Chamber of Commerce, figure out why dark money mischief is something they wanted to defend. And when they got fought to neutral, we then had to take on the American Bar Association, which had been stood up to oppose us. And at the end, it was something called the National Federation of Independent Businesses. And none of it made any sense, except that there is a lot of money behind this economy. And there are a lot of people who are engaged in giving it aid and giving it comfort. And the bankers were very strong because they've already pretty much cleaned up their act. The question is now going to be the stockbrokers, the financial community, realtors, yacht brokers. How do we make sure that American professionals are not engaged in aiding and abetting the hiding of illicit revenues just because they get paid big fees to do it? And that's going to be a continuing political battle, but the bankers are on a good side of it. The Shell Corporation step we took is a big step forward, and now we need to continue by having essentially anti-money laundering provisions that apply across America's professions and not just to the banking industry.
And that's, that's not a completely novel concept in world history. So the whole of the European Union, for example, is required, not just bankers as we have here in the US, but lawyers, real estate agents, accountants, they all have to provide, they all have to report to their respective governments if they come across suspicious transactions, suspicious customers. Do you think being sort of behind on stuff like that has tarnished the US image as an anti-corruption leader? Because on other issues, right, we like to sort of pick on ourselves a lot, but we're actually still in a league of our own when it comes to enforcement, anti-corruption sanctions, those sorts of things that go after the bad guys. We've just had this sort of problem here at home where we've sort of let things fester a bit in terms of not updating our own anti-money laundering laws. How does that look around the world? Do you think?
It absolutely did tarnish us. We blotted our own copybook by not being more energetic in this space. We were well on our way to becoming a bigger, badder version of the Cayman Islands. And frankly, had it not been for the beneficial ownership legislation that cleaned up our Shell Corporation problem, we'd really be an embarrassment to ourselves trying to host a democracy summit. I think that was a very important thing to do, to send a message, at least of directionality, if not of final success.
No, I couldn't agree more. Just moving on sort of on the international front, you mentioned sort of like all the developments that have happened in the time you've been working on this issue to bring you around to the idea that it's a national security issue. That's something that our project was kind of founded to advance the idea of, whereas traditionally I think people had thought of corruption as sort of maybe more of a development or anti-poverty thing. It was something that USAID did, not the Treasury. And so one of the big, we've had several things like the Panama Papers, I think you mentioned those earlier, these series of like leaks that show how people move, the world's richest criminals are moving money around the world. We then had sort of Russiagate, which I don't think we need to sort of get into all the ins and outs, the corridors of all that today. Perhaps it's well known to the American public, but that's the whole point, is that regardless of what you think about that, the American public did see the extent to which their own political elites, or many of them were entangled with some of the most corrupt countries on earth. But now we face sort of a new, the Russia problem hasn't got away. Maybe you want to talk about a bit about that and what leverage we have over Russia. But the main sort of new development is a sort of confrontation, rivalry, competition, whatever you want to call it, with China. And I think it's sometimes, for me personally, I understand why, but I think we think of Russia as the archetypal kleptocracy. We maybe give China's kleptocrats a bit of a free pass. We don't focus on them and their corruption quite as much. Do you have any thoughts on sort of China's role in propagating crime and corruption and kleptocracy around the world? And feel free to comment on Russia as well, because it is such an important part of like how the kleptocracy ball got rolling.
Yeah, I still think of Russia as worse. I think they exist as a kleptocratic regime. My friend John McCain used to say it's a gas station run by gangsters that happens to have an army. And the gangsters part, I think, is very accurate. And Putin has held his oligarchy together by letting them loot their country and hide the goods overseas, where the next worse oligarch can't loot them of their loot. Plus you see Russia directly engaging with us. You see them paying for political attack ads. Facebook was caught receiving payment for political advertising denominated in rubles. You'd think, considering what geniuses Facebook considers themselves to be, they would have figured out that payment in rubles, gee, what clue could we deduce from that? But they blew through that because it was money and that was what they were interested in. So I think I still put Russia at the top of the heap in terms of malign effort against us and in the kleptocracy space. If Putin is in fact the richest person on earth, you know how he got to be there. He stole it and had his henchmen steal it. I think the Chinese are a little bit different. I think they've got a more nationalistic, more political, more sort of doctrinaire approach. And I think they support a lot of corruption around the world if it gets them what they want. So I think they can go into an Asian or an African country and pay bribes left, right, and center and support corrupt governments and be aiders and abettors of the corruption there if it helps them work their goals in that country, expand the, strategy they have overseas of trying to enhance Chinese power and authority around the world. And they have no hesitation about that. They've got nothing like our laws against, bribing officials and so forth. So that's where I may be wrong about that, but I see China as much more of a enabler and facilitator where it's to their strategic advantage, whereas Russia, it's just all about it all the time.
Right. I guess the one of the differences as well is Russia may well be more deliberate and overt in its kleptocracy, but just that the economic sort of impact of China around the world means that when they do, even if it's incidental to their commercial interests rather than some grand plan to trap countries in debt diplomacy, which scholars have sort of cast doubt on.
Russia has an economy the size of Italy.
Right, exactly.
And as the fossil fuel, as the gas station dries up, as we move to a renewable economy, it'll shrink to the size of Switzerland.
Right.
So there's only, their bandwidth is smaller, but their mischief, and I think their danger is greater. China has a much greater bandwidth, huge economic footprint. But I think they take advantage of criminality and corruption primarily to achieve their national policy goals.
And that being the case, I mean, you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it has sort of supercharged corruption, whether deliberately or not, all around the world. What are some of you mentioned sort of, they don't have laws, against bribing foreign officials. In fact, often it's with state-backed companies, it's encouraged. It's a matter of corporate policy to do that. But, we have laws against bribing foreign officials, and sometimes that puts US businesses at a disadvantage. They will complain when they are competing with, a Chinese state-backed company for a project to build a dam in Africa somewhere or something like that. Yeah. And they go to the minister and he says, well, can you give me, 20%? No, because I'll get dragged into the Southern District Court of New York on an FCPA charge or wherever it is. And then the Chinese, guys on the other side of the table just say, sure, no, we'll give you 40%, we just don't want to make it public. What are some of the measures, how would you answer that argument that, taking on corruption is actually, also potentially harmful to the kind of free market, the capitalism, the clean capitalism on which our system thrives, our democracy depends in order to sustain our system?
Well, to go back to where we began, I think that's why it's so important that the Biden administration has raised this up as a priority, because this is one of those situations where, decision by decision, an American company may be advantaged if it can pay a bribe and get a contract and get the work done in a particular country. But each one of those small decisions degrades our credibility and our standing and the strength of rule of law around the world. And the most important strategic goal I think we have is to defend integrity in government and open markets in the economy, because that's the world in which we survive, that's the world in which we thrive, that's the world in which people can live decently. That's a world that supports real democracy as opposed to political thuggery. It's just a far, far better world, and we need to be fighting for it, and we can't allow it to be nibbled away for expediency's sake.
You're also, just to switch some slightly different issues, but the crossover between them, you're also chair of the Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control. And you've also, as you've already mentioned, you mentioned the climate stuff earlier, you've been very outspoken on environmental issues. One of the areas I'm interested in is the way in which kleptocracy isn't just a direct threat itself when you get kind of Russian interference in our elections or, bribery of foreign officials by Chinese state-backed companies, whatever. But it is this kind of crossover where it fuels other national security threats. And that's kind of the proper way to understand the full scope of this problem. Maybe with reference to the illegal drugs trade and climate environmental issues, two seemingly quite disparate sort of issues. Do you find crossover in your work on kleptocracy and those areas in the Congress?
Yeah, the common thread is dark money and the ability to hide the transit of money. we, with respect to the narcotics empire, the international narcotics empire, we have focused an awful lot on the drug distribution network. And as a prosecutor, I did this myself. We would, hit the hideout and have the photo op with the, pounds of heroin or cocaine and the guns and the money and all of that. But I don't think, have focused as much on the ledger side. And obviously, for every dollar in drugs you sell, a dollar comes in. That's what the business is. And if you can disrupt the flow of the money, I think you can do as much damage to the enterprise behind it as you do by interrupting the flow of the product. And in fact, I think you can actually do more damage because you work your way more rapidly to the top and you disable the institution itself in its ability to hide its revenues. Whereas trying to stop drugs coming in is, you're kind of by definition driving yourselves closer to the consumer and further away from the center of the web. So in my work in the International Counter-Narcotics Caucus, we've been trying to push our emphasis to the dark money financing side of the international narcotics empire. And similarly, as I started figuring out what the hell went wrong when suddenly climate change became a purely partisan thing, and it tagged perfectly with the Citizens United decision, the arrival of unlimited amounts of money in American politics, and the arrival of that unlimited money behind screens that hid from the public who the real actor was. And my very strong sense that it's the fossil fuel industry that was paying to buy obstruction of climate solutions. And then when you try to fix some of the things that would keep foreign influence from coming into our country, you run afoul of the domestic pressure. Wait a minute, we want our dark money channels. We want to be able to hide our hands. We want to be able to manipulate American politics from behind screens. And now you have the predicament of, well, if you can manipulate American politics from behind screens, what keeps Vladimir Putin from doing that? Or the Iranian government or any other foreign malign actor. And of course, where you provide an avenue of secrecy, anybody can come through it secretly because that's what secrecy is. So we become to a degree sort of the agents of our own destruction when we countenance all of this dark money in our own politics. So it ties together in that sense.
I know it was sort of coming more towards the end of our time now. So I wanted to take some time. You've been rolling out lots. You were obviously a champion, very focused on the Shell company issue. Which and huge congratulations to you.
And particular thanks to Lindsey Graham and Chuck Grassley on Judiciary, who kept this alive and kicking for a long time.
Yeah.
If public could have seen Lindsey Graham grilling the NFIB about their opposition to our bill, you would have loved that moment because it was a real dressing down. And then Mike Crapo, as chair of finance, took it up and we moved the jurisdiction to finance, and they were able to get it passed with his and Sherrod Brown's strong support. So I want to do big thank yous to those colleagues who worked very hard to make this happen.
No, sure. Actually, that's a good sort of question, maybe. And feel free to demur if you don't, think it's a good approach. But one of the things that crossed my mind with the Biden administration adopting this counter-kleptocracy, this anti-corruption, agenda so closely, so strongly, is that sometimes in DC, unfortunately, just because one side takes something up, the other side decides they want to start, opposing it. You're
for it, so I got to be against it.
Exactly. So, it has been just this remarkable bipartisan, you talked about all the touchy domestic political issues that corruption can exacerbate. And of course, corruption is the first political insult you want to sling at an opponent in an election, right? If you can get away with it. So given that how partisan corruption can be and is around the world, it is amazing how bipartisan the sort of anti-kleptocracy effort has been so far in the Congress. And I wondered how do you sort of keep it that way?
Because of Hudson Institute's good offices, by the way. So thank you for that.
Well, exactly, no, but everyone has been working across the aisle. I work with in my own little NGO world with people from who I wouldn't have anything to agree with otherwise, apart from and I've made wonderful friends along the way.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've done the same in the Congress working on this issue. How do you think we can keep this as a bipartisan issue and avoid those sorts of problems?
I think that continuing to recognize its national security priority is the most important thing that we can do. I think the Biden administration sending that signal through the Democracy Summit is really powerful. I think General Petraeus, who's been a national security leader in the intelligence community, in the military community, as a thinker, stepping up and expressing his views that this is a national security priority has been very helpful. I think having the array of DC think tanks that represent a quite broad political spectrum converge and agree that this is a national security issue that we have to address. I think all of that opens space for us to do good work. And then we're left with the individual graft and greed of different industry participants who want to keep making the money. The yacht broker who wants to sell the Russian oligarch the multi-million-dollar yacht, the realtor who wants to sell to a phony trust the expensive apartment, the stockbrokers and financiers who want to provide investment vehicles for shady characters. They will rise up to be heard, usually through intermediaries, and I think that's going to be the battle, is to push back against those folks. And I think the national security issue and the patriotism issue really help us resolve those purely crass commercial counter pressures.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, on that note, you've brought forward, fresh off the back of the Shell company success, this year has not been, the pace has not slackened in the Congress on this stuff, and you've once again been out front leading with a bunch of new bills that relate to this fight against transnational crime and corruption. I was wondering if you could just walk us through some of the highlights, some of the bills that you're most excited about that you've co-sponsored or sponsored.
Sure.
Talk us through them and what they do.
Well, Senator Tillis has joined me in the Foreign Enablers Act. We talked earlier about how an American company can be prosecuted for paying a bribe to a foreign official, but it's not an offense for a foreign official to demand or extort a bribe from an American company. We want to clarify that that is prosecutable. And I think that's important because even if you end up having trouble getting your hands on that official, extraditing them, making the criminal case, the criminal case can still be made by indictment. It can be put before the world, and sanctions can then be applied quite readily. So there's quite a good set of countermeasures that we can apply to corruption if we follow that path without actually having to get handcuffs around the foreign officials' wrists. So I think that's going to be an important piece of legislation. I thank Tom for joining me. We're also working on we call it at this point the Enablers Act for domestic participants. And it's basically to follow what the EU has done and expand the money laundering rules that banks operate under very satisfactorily from their point of view, by the way, because it keeps them out of trouble, to these other professionals who are presently engaged in providing, whether you call it aiding and abetting or aid and comfort to our international enemies. It's figuring out how to clean that up. And that's going to be a long and arduous battle, but I think it's an important one to begin and to fight and to win.
Well, they would both be, from someone who studies this stuff day in, day out, those two measures alone would be utterly transformational if we were to get those in place, because bringing the US, law enforcement system, our control of the global reserve currency and the long arm of jurisdiction that gives us would send shockwaves through the global criminal networks that fuel this kind of transnational groups. So I wish you all the best with those.
Think what good it would do around the world. One doesn't have to hypothesize broke, beleaguered countries whose political class has basically extracted all of the wealth in the form of bribery and self-dealing, and don't have decent roads, don't have decent hospitals, don't have decent living conditions, if we could stop the exfiltration of all their money by the corrupt leaders, and perhaps even help them track it down and bring it back and invest it in the roads and the hospitals and living conditions, suddenly the battle between rule of law world and kleptocracy, criminality, autocracy world begins to have a lot of defenders, a lot of new allies in kleptocracy, criminality, and autocracy world, because they see when they go with us that the goods of their country are returned to them, and they get wealthier, and they can lead more honest lives, and they can feel safer and have better communities. So I think it's a potentially kind of a tipping point situation where once you're over that point where you're actually helping these countries, it gets harder and harder for the autocrats and the kleptocrats to keep control. And then the whole world begins to turn into a brighter and better place. And as Winston Churchill would say, you know, we move on to broad and sunlit uplands.
Well, that is a tremendous and inspiring thought and thing to look forward to. But I just realized we're running over time. You're obviously doing very important work that I don't want to keep you from on this front. So it falls to me to just thank you again for joining us at Hudson Institute and to wish you the best of luck with the legislation you mentioned before and all your other efforts on the counter-kleptocracy, counter-corruption front.
Well, thank you, Nate.
Look forward to having you back soon.
And thank you, Kleptocracy Initiative.